Larry Fink said it explicitly. Everything will be tokenized. Everything will be on the same universal digital ledger. Every asset will have a unique identifier number. This is not speculation. This is the public statement of the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset manager on Earth, with approximately $12 trillion under management. And the conversation that's happening in the crypto community right now is the right conversation. If everything is going to be tokenized and put on a unified ledger, what is the ledger? Is it Ethereum? Is it XRP? Is it Solana? Is it something else entirely? Is it a combination? Because whichever answer turns out to be correct, the infrastructure underneath that unified ledger becomes the most valuable technology stack in financial history. Not because of meme narratives or price predictions. Because of the functional reality that all tokenized value has to move across specific rails, and the rails that handle the most volume at the highest reliability capture disproportionate economic value. Today I'm going to give you the honest framework for understanding this question. What Fink has actually said versus what people are interpreting. What the documented technical architecture shows about which networks handle which roles. Why the natural assets conversation that Whitney Webb raised is real and important, but also separate from the infrastructure question. What XRP's specific positioning in the unified ledger vision actually looks like, based on evidence. And why the answer is almost certainly not a single network winning everything. Because when you understand the architecture correctly, you position across the right assets for the right reasons. Not based on tribal allegiance, but based on which networks serve, which functions in the actual tokenization build-out. This is not financial advice. I am sharing publicly available information for educational purposes. Always do your own research. Before we get into it, drop unified ledger in the comments if Fink's vision is what has your attention. Drop natural assets if the tokenization of rivers, forests, and commons is the part that concerns you most. Drop both if you see these as connected pieces of the same broader transformation, because the tokenization conversation has multiple dimensions, and each one affects how you should position. Welcome back. I am the calm analyst. Around here, we don't push single asset maximalism. We analyze architecture. Today, we're unpacking the unified ledger framework, showing you where Ethereum serves which functions, where XRP serves which functions, where the natural assets tokenization fits in, and why the conversation that's dominating crypto Twitter is actually misframing the question in ways that produce bad positioning decisions. Let's get into it. Let me start with what Fink actually said, because the precise language matters. Larry Fink said he wants the SEC to rapidly approve the tokenization of bonds and stocks. He said once assets are tokenized, the whole idea of needing custodians falls apart. He described $4.1 trillion in digital wallets globally, much of it outside the United States, and said tokenizing ETFs lets BlackRock reach the younger investors who already hold crypto but haven't yet moved into traditional retirement products. He's also talked about an interconnected world ledger and tokenized value systems at the World Economic Forum. He's emphasized transforming SWIFT's outdated financial rails into instant, interoperable global settlement systems based on distributed ledger technology. What he hasn't said is which specific blockchain runs the unified ledger. He hasn't endorsed Ethereum by name as the infrastructure. He hasn't endorsed XRP by name. He hasn't endorsed any specific network as the definitive answer. The crypto community is doing what crypto communities always do, reading the statements through their tribal lens and extracting the interpretation that confirms their bags. Ethereum holders hear Fink and see Ethereum validated. XRP holders Here Fink and CXRP validate it. Solana holders find ways to read it as Solana validation. The honest reading is that Fink is describing a vision of interconnected, tokenized value infrastructure. He's not specifying which networks run which components because the actual deployment is still being determined through market competition, regulatory development, and technical evaluation. But the evidence of where BlackRock is actually deploying matters more than the public statements. And the deployment evidence shows a specific pattern that deserves careful examination. If understanding the distinction between Fink's public vision and his company's actual technical deployments just sharpen the analysis for you, smash that like button, because the deployment evidence is where the real positioning signals live, not in the speeches. Now let me walk through what BlackRock is actually doing, because this is the part most people don't examine carefully. BlackRock launched the Beedle tokenized money market fund. Initial deployment was on Ethereum. The fund has grown to over $500 million in assets. Then BlackRock announced expansion to additional blockchains: Aptos, Avalanche, Arbitrum, Optimism, Polygon, and others. Multi-chain deployment is the explicit strategy. And then this year, Ripple and BlackRock, through Securitize, integrated RLUSD as a settlement and liquidity layer for BYDL. Holders of BYDL can now swap into RLUSD through smart contracts for instant dollar liquidity. The XRP ledger and RLUSD are part of the BYDL settlement infrastructure alongside the multiple chains BYDL deploys on. This is architecturally significant. BlackRock isn't picking one blockchain as the tokenization layer. They're using Ethereum and multiple EVM chains as the issuance layer, where the tokenized securities actually live. And they're using RLUSD on the XRP ledger as a settlement and liquidity layer, where instant dollar conversion happens. These are different functions. Issuance is where the tokenized asset is minted and maintained. Settlement is where value moves when the asset is traded or redeemed. A single tokenization infrastructure can use different blockchains for different functions. Ethereum plus EVM chains are positioned as the issuance layer for tokenized securities because they have the mature smart contract ecosystem for complex financial instruments with custom logic. The XRP ledger is positioned as the settlement layer because it has the speed, cost, and liquidity architecture for high-volume value movement without the overhead of smart contract complexity. This is the real answer to the unified ledger question. It's not a single network. It's a multi-layer architecture where different networks serve different functions. Ethereum and EVM chains for the complex logic of tokenized securities. The XRP ledger for the high-velocity settlement and cross-chain liquidity bridging. Other pieces fit in too. Bitcoin serves as a reserve asset and store of value layer. Stablecoins like USDC and RLUSD serve as the dollar-denominated liquidity layer. CBDCs will eventually serve as the sovereign money layer. Each component has its function. The networks that capture the most value in this architecture are not necessarily the ones where tokens are issued. They're the ones that handle the most transaction volume, because transaction volume drives fees, which drives token demand, which drives price appreciation. Comment below. Which layer do you think captures the most value over the next decade? Type issuance. If you think the network where assets are minted captures most value. Type settlement if you think the settlement layer captures most value. Type reserve if you think the store of value layer captures most. Because the layer that captures the most value is where the largest capital appreciation occurs. Now let me address the specific technical match between Fink's described vision and XRP's architecture. Because analysts have pointed out that the description matches Ripple's technology almost word for word. Fink described a system with instant settlement, interoperable global rails, replacement for SWIFT, transparency through distributed ledger, and the ability to tokenize and transfer assets instantly. Let me compare that to the XRP ledger's documented capabilities. Instant settlement. The XRP ledger settles in 3 to 5 seconds with final, irreversible confirmation. Interoperable global rails. The XRP ledger operates chain agnostically and is integrated with SWIFT through multiple certified pathways. Replacement for SWIFT. Ripple Treasury processes 13 trillion dollars annual payments with SWIFT certification and native digital asset capabilities. Transparency. Every transaction on the XRP ledger is publicly auditable. Asset tokenization. The XRP ledger supports native token issuance, escrow, and compliance controls. Now let me compare Fink's description to Ethereum's capabilities. Instant settlement. Ethereum settles in 12 to 15 seconds with probabilistic finality, requiring confirmations before transactions are considered final. Interoperable global rails. Ethereum is the most widely adopted blockchain for smart contract applications, but requires Layer 2s for cost-effective transactions at scale. Replacement for SWIFT. Ethereum itself is not integrated with SWIFT as a certified settlement partner. Transparency? Yes. Tokenization. Through smart contracts with extensive flexibility. Both networks serve tokenization functions. But the specific settlement characteristics that Fink described match XRP's architecture more precisely than Ethereum's base layer. That doesn't mean Ethereum doesn't play a role. It clearly does in the issuance layer. It means the settlement layer description aligns with XRP's specific technical positioning. This matches what BlackRock's actual deployment shows. Issuance happens on Ethereum and EVM chains. Settlement happens increasingly through RLUSD and the XRP ledger. The multi-layer architecture uses each network for what each network does best. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell, drop A in the comments, because the multi-layer architecture of tokenization infrastructure is where the real positioning decisions live. And understanding which layer captures value at which rate is how you position across the full stack rather than betting everything on one network. Now the natural assets dimension. Because Whitney Webb's reporting on this raises questions that deserve honest treatment separate from the infrastructure question. The natural assets concept involves identifying ecological resources, forests, rivers, lakes, rainforests, ecosystems, and creating financial instruments that represent ownership or stewardship rights over those resources. The Natural Asset Corporation model allows these resources to be identified, tokenized, and sold as financial products. Whitney Webb's concern, which is legitimate, is that this financializes the commons. Things that have historically been treated as public goods become private financial instruments. The revenue generated from those instruments flows to financial intermediaries rather than to the public benefit. And the infrastructure that tracks these assets involves surveillance technology over natural spaces. These are real concerns. They deserve public debate, and they are separate from the question of which blockchain infrastructure handles these tokenized assets. Here's the honest analysis. If natural assets tokenization happens, and the evidence suggests efforts are underway, it will happen on some blockchain infrastructure. The infrastructure itself is neutral. A rainforest tokenized on Ethereum is ethically identical to a rainforest tokenized on the XRP ledger. The ethical questions are about the tokenization concept itself, not about which network processes the tokens. For positioning purposes, this matters because the infrastructure that processes tokenized natural assets captures transaction fees, regardless of whether you personally support the tokenization of natural resources. You can be ethically opposed to financializing the commons, while still recognizing that the infrastructure handling those transactions appreciates in value as volume grows. This is a common tension in any transformative technology. The internet enabled both positive and negative outcomes. Blockchain infrastructure will do the same. Your ethical positioning on specific use cases, whether tokenized rainforests should exist, is a separate question from your financial positioning on the infrastructure that processes any tokenization volume. The calm investor acknowledges both dimensions. They hold positions in infrastructure that benefits from tokenization volume. They also support ethical frameworks that prevent harmful applications of that infrastructure. Both can be true simultaneously. And conflating them leads to poor decisions in both domains. Now let me address the BIS, IMF, and World Economic Forum involvement with XRP. Because the documented evidence matters. The IMF published a report titled Trust Bridges and Money Flows that mentioned XRP and XLM on page 23 as digital assets in cross-border payment infrastructure context. This is documented. It's a real reference in a real IMF publication. The BIS published their money flower diagram that designates space for private cryptocurrencies in the global monetary framework. Again, documented. Ripple has participated in central bank working groups and has partnerships with multiple central banks for CBDC development. Palau, Hong Kong, Montenegro, Colombia, Bhutan. These are operational deployments, not pilots. The World Economic Forum has hosted discussions about tokenization, interoperability, and the future of finance that involve Ripple leadership and XRP ledger technology, among other participants. These documented connections don't mean the global financial system is being secretly rebuilt around XRP. But they do mean that XRP is positioned within the conversations and infrastructure decisions that will shape how tokenization unfolds at the institutional and sovereign levels. For retail holders, the implication is that XRP has institutional relationships that most other cryptocurrencies don't have. Those relationships don't guarantee price appreciation, but they position the asset at the table where the decisions about tokenization architecture are being made. And the assets positioned at that table have structural advantages over those that aren't. Let me leave you with this. The unified ledger question is real. Larry Fink's vision is real. BlackRock's deployment strategy is real. The tokenization wave is real. The $16 trillion projection from Boston Consulting Group is a documented base case. The answer to which network runs the unified ledger is almost certainly multiple networks serving different functions in a multi-layer architecture. Ethereum and EVM chains for issuance. The XRP ledger for settlement and cross-chain liquidity. Bitcoin for reserve. Stablecoins like RLUSD and USDC for dollar liquidity. CBDCs for sovereign money. Each component serving its function. The networks that capture the most value in this architecture are the ones that handle the most transaction volume at the most critical layers. Settlement infrastructure, in particular, captures disproportionate value because every transaction across the entire stack needs to settle somewhere. XRP's architecture is specifically optimized for the settlement layer function. That doesn't make it the only asset worth holding. It doesn't displace Ethereum's role in the issuance layer, but it does make XRP a critical component of the tokenization infrastructure stack with documented institutional integration. The honest positioning strategy isn't to hold only XRP and dismiss Ethereum. It isn't to hold only Ethereum and dismiss XRP. It's to understand which networks serve which functions in the unified ledger architecture and position across the components based on where each captures value. Most retail investors pick one asset tribally and defend it against all others. Institutional investors construct portfolios across the multi-layer architecture. The institutional approach produces better long-term outcomes because it aligns positioning with the actual technical reality rather than with tribal allegiance. If you only hold XRP, that's fine. But you should understand that you're concentrated on the settlement layer and you're missing exposure to the issuance layer. If you only hold Ethereum, you should understand that you're concentrated on issuance and missing exposure to settlement. If you hold both, you're positioned across the architecture as institutions actually deploy it. The natural assets question is separate. Your ethical views on whether nature should be tokenized should inform your activism and your voice. They don't need to determine whether you own infrastructure that processes any tokenization volume. These are different decisions operating on different dimensions. Price is a distraction. Value is the reality. Structure is what matters. And the structure of the unified ledger that Fink describes. A multi-layer architecture where different networks serve different functions is the structure that actually captures value in the tokenization wave. Positioning for that structure rather than betting on single network maximalism is how institutional investors approach this opportunity. And the retail investors who adopt that framework tend to outperform the tribal defenders over multi-year horizons. In a market fueled by emotion and noise, we thrive on data and composure. Remember, haste leads to loss, while calm analysis leads to victory. Comment, calm analyst, below and tell me honestly, are you positioned across the tokenization stack or concentrated on a single network? Because the honest answer to that question determines whether you're set up to capture the full tokenization wave or only the portion of it that happens on your preferred chain. Like, subscribe, notifications on. I'll see you in the next one. Stay patient, stay rational, and as we always do, we don't wait for the future. We plan for it. Peace.